Hi everyone, and thank you for being with me today to have a discussion around something that, as I often say, is important to me and hopefully to you as well. Today there was a release of the report in the Closing the Gap report, which is about where we sit in relation to indigenous people, and particularly our concern, which is in a number of areas. Number one, how many indigenous kids are being removed from their families compared to the general population, and how many kids are being incarcerated, and also how many kids are suffering from domestic violence and mental well-being issues and a whole range of things. I'm only going to deal with one of those today, and that is the primary one, which is about bridging the gap in relation to those children that are placed in out-of-home care. It should be a concern to all of us that this particular area has not changed. In fact, it has become worse over the years. It is an area which, regretfully, has never been addressed, or if there has been any effort to address it, we haven't been able to see where it has been addressed, or at least there's no data to demonstrate that it has. Now, we understand that there has been significant changes in some of those communities. Anthony Albanese gave a speech today in Parliament in relation to closing the gap, and he did talk about Burke, for example, in New South Wales, where the recidivism rate has decreased, number of young people that are being imprisoned has decreased, domestic violence has also decreased. So there are certain pockets within Australia where the communities have been able to address these issues. It is evident that they can only address these issues where there is community consultation. So the involvement of First Nations people in these discussions is primary, it's imperative, it's important. What does concern me is that the involvement of child protection services in this discussion seems to be missing. If the child protection services were listening to First Nations people, I'm sure they'd understand that there is a sense of community that Indigenous people have that may appear to be different from the Western version of what community should look like. It is unique. It has been, I guess, operationalised for some 60,000 years, and it works for First Nations people. And at some level, we need to understand, as different as it may be from ours, and that we need to make sure that issues such as domestic violence, mental well-being, drug use and so on is also minimised within these communities, because that's just dangerous for everybody. But perhaps we could consider that if communities were able to manage their situations differently around what community means to them, rather than the westernised version of that, and that we could implement policies that were catering for the First Nations view of their own communities, and that they could find unique ways to manage and look after their children and keep them safe, which I'm sure they can, then perhaps we would eventually have different outcomes than the ones that we have. So I want to refer direct to the Closing the Gap report, which came out today, and highlight the fact that this area around kids in Australia is in fact getting worse, not just for Indigenous kids, but for all kids. But primarily we're going to talk about First Nations children, given that is what this report is basically about. So, in order to do so, I'm going to click on the right one. So in order to do so, we're just going to have a look at this part of the report. So the objective here is to that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are not overrepresented in the child protection system. This is the goal, and it's clear from the data, which I'll discuss in just a moment, that this is not happening, and it's a concern to myself. I don't know where you're watching this, if you're watching this on my YouTube channel or whether you're watching this on the CPP YouTube channel, whichever one it is. I'm delivering, and I'm concerned about what all of this means. So by 2031, The objective is to reduce the rate of overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children, that's 0 to 17 obviously, in out-of-home care by 45%. So almost to cut the number of children that are being removed by half. Now that to me is a lofty aim. So what's that, 9 years from now, they wish to be able to, the government wishes to be able to do this. Now what policies they plan to implement in this time, what negotiations with First Nations people they plan to partake of is a completely different issue. And we don't know exactly what that looks like. I understand that the government's spending somewhere around $85 million in order to improve this particular area. But as long as this area, that is the area of child protection, is governed and managed by white people, it will never change. The preconceived ideas, the judgmentalism that takes place around Indigenous people is horrific, and that comes from white people. So once we find a way to let go of that system and for First Nations people to manage that themselves, I believe, the better. Because we're doing a shitty job. We're not doing the job that we should be doing, and it is impacting young people, particularly children, and of course their families. So nationally in 2021, the rate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children out of home care was 57.6 per 1,000 children in the population. This is an increase from 54, so it's a minor increase, but the point is it's not a decrease. If they wish to decrease this down to 45%, they're looking at 45%, then a great deal of work clearly needs to be done. This is an increase from 54.2 per 1,000 children in 2019. Nationally, based on progress from the baseline, the target is worsening. However, this assessment should be used with caution as it is based on a limited number of data points. I don't know what those data points specifically are, so I can't comment on that. But this graph is telling. So the blue graph is non-Indigenous people. This is the actual number of non-Indigenous people, and we see that it is steady. Now, I think number one, we need to celebrate that perhaps the steadiness is a good thing, even though I don't think this reflects it appropriately. We'll have a look at some figures in a second if I can bring them up that will demonstrate that that figure is also increasing, but not to the same extent as it is in the Indigenous numbers, which can also be seen here in red. So these figures at the red are demonstrating to us that it is supposedly increasing. Where it has to get to is this red, is this dashed line down to 30. That's 30 children per 100,000. At the moment, it's about 54. So to get it down to that point is going to take us 8 years, apparently. And the work that needs to be done in order to get there is, I think, extreme. And as I said before, we don't exactly know how it is that they plan to do that. Now, I've got this other graph, which I won't bring up on the screen because it's a bit awkward to present at the moment. But I'll tell you what it says. It says that the actual rate of Indigenous people in 2018 per 100,000 is 57.6. In 2019, it was 54.2. The actual rate in relation to non-Indigenous children, now wait for it, the actual rate per non-Indigenous children was in 2021 was 5. In Indigenous populations, it's 57.6. In non-Indigenous families, it is 5 per 100,000. If you can't see a discrepancy there, you're blind or stupid, one or the other. The rate in non-Indigenous people in 2019 was 5.1, so it's decreased slightly. But the overall rate is increasing significantly with Indigenous people. I think most of you would agree with me, this is a concern for all of us. Now, we need to work hard to be able to change the way governments view this. There's a wonderful speech by Anthony Albanese today. I do appreciate the fact that he was able to highlight what the report said that was positive, and there were a number of areas where it was, but the primary areas of concern to us the incarceration rates of Indigenous children and the number of kids that are in out-of-home care. This has to change. We as a community have to decide to find ways to be able to inform our political leaders that this is no longer acceptable, and that they, as those that are responsible for the legislation which brings about these changes, need to put their foot on the gas and do something about it as soon as possible. This is an issue which should concern all of us as we're moving further towards having a voice for Indigenous people enshrined in our legislation. We need to be demonstrating that we are listening to them now, that we are about making sure that we as a community, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are working towards the same goal. The same applies for those kids that are in, those non-Indigenous kids that are in out-of-home care. We should be doing more work to ensure that their families are cared for, that those children are living in safe environments, and that they too should not be placed into out-of-home care at a particular rate. In fact, what we should be seeing is a marginal or a massive decrease actually in the number of kids in out-of-home care right across the board. And as that graph demonstrates to us, that the decline that we expect to see, or the closing the gap wishes to see over the next 9 years, is considerable, and that we need to ensure that we meet those goals. We'd be interested to know what you think, no matter where you're watching this. Let us know any ideas that you've got about the way that we could better present that, whether it be the Child Protection Party or here on my on my YouTube channel. Please let me know. It would help to have a discussion with you about where you stand in relation to this issue. And if you're watching this on YouTube, could you please subscribe and ring the bell wherever you may be watching it, so that you can get further updates on any of the issues that we're discussing. Take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.